You made a mistake on line 3. Systems built on arrogance usually collapse first. People should stay in the lane they belong to. Adrian Whitmore said it calmly as quiet laughter spread around the ballroom table. The billionaire thought humiliating a waitress might entertain his wealthy guests, for a few minutes. What he did not know, was that, the woman standing in front of him, had once been one of Princeton's brightest doctoral researchers. And before the night ended, she was about to embarrass him in front of half of Manhattan. Rain slid down the massive windows of the Whitmore Foundation ballroom, while investors and executives drank beneath crystal chandeliers. Evelyn Carter adjusted the sleeve of her waitress uniform, and balanced a tray of sparkling water against one palm. Her feet ached after nearly 12 hours on shift, but she kept her posture straight. Never let hard days bend your spine. Her mother's words echoed softly in her head as she crossed the crowded room. At the center of the crowd stood Adrian Whitmore himself. Tall. Calm. Effortlessly powerful. At 40, Adrian was one of New York's most feared investors, a billionaire whose approval could build companies overnight. People admired his intelligence almost as much as they feared his arrogance. "That's Whitmore," another waitress had whispered earlier. "Don't make mistakes around him. He enjoys embarrassing people." Evelyn remembered the warning the moment she approached his table. "The model keeps failing under pressure," one executive admitted nervously. Adrian swirled bourbon in his glass. "Then your engineers are less competent than I thought." Awkward laughter followed. Evelyn carefully placed fresh glasses onto the table before speaking without thinking. "Because the system trusts itself more than real data," she said softly. "It stops adapting." Silence. Several executives turned toward her. Adrian slowly looked up for the first time that evening. His eyes moved across her uniform, her tray, her name tag. Assessing. Dismissing. "Interesting," he said. "Our waitress understands predictive systems." A few guests chuckled quietly. Evelyn lowered her eyes. "Sorry, sir. I didn't mean to interrupt." Then Adrian noticed the small notebook partially hidden inside her apron pocket, pages filled with equations and handwritten notes. "What's that?" "Nothing important." One executive smirked. "Maybe she's secretly running a hedge fund." Laughter spread again. Adrian picked up a silver fountain pen, and wrote several advanced equations across a folded linen napkin before sliding it toward her. "If you understand the conversation so well," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "solve it." The room grew quieter. Evelyn stared at the equation silently. She could walk away. Ignore him. Finish the shift. Evelyn rubbed the fading ink stain on her wrist, a leftover mark from the Princeton lab she no longer belonged to. But then Adrian leaned back slightly and added, "People should stay in the lane they belong to." Something inside Evelyn tightened. For a brief second, she remembered the hospital bills waiting at home, and the night she sold her younger brother's bed just to buy groceries. She froze. Then, slowly, she set her tray onto the marble table. One glass trembled softly against the silver surface, the only sound in the sudden silence. From her apron pocket, she pulled out a battered notebook, its edges frayed, its pages crowded with dense, handwritten equations. She laid it beside Adrian's napkin like a silent challenge. Without taking her eyes off his, Evelyn reached forward, and took the pen from Adrian's hand. The ballroom watched in silence as Evelyn lowered her eyes to the napkin and began writing. At first, Adrian looked amused. Then his expression slowly changed. Evelyn moved through the equations faster than anyone expected, crossing out one section before rewriting it in cleaner notation. The executives leaned closer immediately. "You made a mistake on line 3, Evelyn said softly in perfect German. "The instability curve never stabilizes naturally." Complete silence swallowed the table. Then, without looking up, she added another equation beneath his. "But mathematically," she continued calmly in fluent French, Systems built on arrogance usually collapse first. No one laughed this time. Adrian stared at the napkin in front of him, jaw tightening slightly. She had not only solved the equation. She had corrected it. That's impossible, one executive whispered. Evelyn calmly placed the pen back onto the table. No, she replied quietly. It's just unfinished. For the first time that evening, something inside Adrian Whitmore cracked. Not anger. Not humiliation. Curiosity. Where did you learn that? He asked. Evelyn lifted her tray again. Excuse me, sir. I still have tables to cover. Then she turned and walked away beneath the golden ballroom lights while whispers exploded behind her. Who is she? She solved it in seconds. Did you hear her French? Adrian remained motionless beside the cocktail table, staring at the rewritten equations as though they had personally insulted him. One executive finally cleared his throat carefully. She's right, he admitted. Your stabilization assumption was wrong. Adrian said nothing. Meanwhile, Evelyn disappeared through the kitchen doors into the quieter world behind the ballroom. Industrial lights replaced chandeliers. The smell of expensive cologne gave way to coffee, soap, and exhaustion. Evelyn, another waitress whispered. What on earth was that? Evelyn ignored the question and placed the tray beside the dishwasher station. Only now did her hands begin to shake slightly. Not from fear. From exhaustion. The kitchen manager stormed toward her moments later. Do you have any idea who that was? He snapped. That was Adrian Whitmore. I know. Then why would you embarrass him in front of half the city? Evelyn looked down briefly before answering. I didn't embarrass him. The manager opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. Because somewhere deep down, he knew she was right. Hours later, Evelyn finally left the ballroom and stepped into the cold Manhattan rain. 2 subway rides later, the glass towers of Manhattan gave way to darker neighborhoods in Queens. Inside a small third-floor apartment, her younger brother Daniel slept on the couch beneath a pile of textbooks. A red final notice letter rested beside a stack of unpaid medical bills. Evelyn stared at the crimson ink for a long time before opening her worn-out bag. With trembling but careful hands, she placed her notebook, filled with doctoral-level equations, right next to the pawn shop receipts. To the world outside, she was just a waitress drowning in debt, but within these frayed pages, she was a genius. She stood there in the silence, looking at the 2 halves of her life. Then suddenly, her phone buzzed against the kitchen counter. Unknown number. She hesitated before answering. Hello. A calm male voice replied almost immediately. This is Adrian Whitmore. Evelyn froze. Rain tapped softly against the apartment window, while Adrian's voice lowered on the other end of the line. I think we need to talk, he said quietly. Then after a brief pause, he added, because people don't accidentally solve doctoral-level equations, while carrying champagne trays. A person can survive poverty much easier than they can survive being underestimated every single day. Evelyn stood silently in the tiny apartment kitchen, while Adrian Whitmore's voice lingered through the phone, like a problem she no longer had the strength to solve. I think you have the wrong idea about me, Mr. Whitmore, Evelyn said quietly. For a moment, Adrian said nothing. Then his calm voice returned. No, he replied. I think I had the wrong idea about you. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. She was too tired for curiosity. Too tired for wealthy men who treated intelligence like entertainment. It's late, she said softly. I have work tomorrow. You solved an equation my analysts couldn't solve for weeks, Adrian said. People like you don't end up carrying champagne trays by accident. Evelyn looked toward the refrigerator. Nearly empty. Her mother's medication refill was due Thursday. Her paycheck arrived Friday. The math no longer worked. Good night, Mr. Whitmore. She ended the call before he could answer. For several seconds, the apartment remained completely quiet except for the rain outside. Then Daniel stirred awake slightly on the couch. "You're home late," he murmured sleepily. "Big event tonight." Daniel studied her face for a second. "Something happened?" Evelyn grabbed a glass from the sink. "Just rich people acting important." A faint smile crossed his face before fading again. At 19, Daniel already looked exhausted. Most days, balancing college classes with delivery shifts, while pretending not to notice the overdue bills piling up around them. "You should quit that place," he said quietly. Evelyn gave a tired laugh. "And do what instead?" Daniel's gaze flickered toward the red medical bills on the counter before he looked away. The silence between them heavy with the truth they both hated. Neither of them answered after that. Because they already knew. The next morning arrived gray and cold over Manhattan. By 7:30, Evelyn sat quietly on the subway heading back, toward Sterling Oak with her worn notebook resting inside her bag. An old Princeton conference badge still sat folded inside her wallet. She had not touched it in almost 3 years. Everything had changed the afternoon her mother collapsed in a grocery store parking lot. In an instant, Evelyn's world of abstract equations was replaced by the cold reality of ICU monitors, mounting debt, and the relentless grind of survival. Outside the subway windows, the city blurred past in streaks of gray concrete and rain. By the time the train reached Midtown, Evelyn had already buried those memories again where they belonged. She had hoped the humiliation from the ballroom would be forgotten by morning. It wasn't. The moment she stepped inside Sterling Oak, conversations near the coffee station softened noticeably. Several waitresses glanced toward her before quickly looking away. Even the kitchen manager seemed uncomfortable. "Quite a performance last night," he muttered while handing her the lunch assignments. "I only answered a question," Evelyn replied calmly. Before he could answer, the restaurant doors opened. Silence spread almost instantly across the dining room. Adrian Whitmore walked inside wearing a dark navy coat over a charcoal suit, rainwater still glistening faintly on his shoulders. His eyes found Evelyn immediately. Then, to everyone's shock, the billionaire walked directly toward the waitress he had publicly humiliated less than 12 hours earlier. Evelyn felt dozens of eyes following him through the restaurant. Adrian stopped a few feet away from her. Up close in daylight, he looked different. Somehow. Less polished. More tired. More human. "Good morning, Evelyn," he said calmly. Nearby servers froze completely. "Mr. Whitmore." Without breaking eye contact, Adrian reached into his coat pocket and placed a folded document onto the hostess stand between them. "Whitmore Capital pulled your Princeton records this morning," he said quietly. Evelyn's stomach tightened. Slowly, she unfolded the page. Princeton University. Department of Applied Mathematics. Doctoral Fellowship Candidate. Evelyn Carter. Full academic distinction. Her fingers froze around the paper. Adrian studied her expression carefully before speaking again. This time, his voice held no arrogance at all. Only quiet disbelief. Why would someone brilliant enough for Princeton end up here? Sometimes the hardest thing about losing your dreams is pretending you no longer miss them. The lunch crowd at Sterling Oak moved around Evelyn in a blur of polished shoes, expensive watches, and quiet conversations while Adrian Whitmore's question lingered heavily between them. Why would someone brilliant enough for Princeton end up here? Evelyn stared silently at the document in her hands. Her own name looked unfamiliar printed across official university paper now, almost like it belonged to another version of herself entirely. Around them, servers pretended not to listen while listening to every word. Adrian stood calmly beside the hostess station, but the arrogance from the ballroom was gone now. Only curiosity remained. Evelyn folded the Princeton document carefully before handing it back to him. "Life happens," she said softly. Adrian studied her for a moment. "That is not really an answer." For the first time since the ballroom, Evelyn looked directly into his eyes. "No, Mr. Whitmore," she replied quietly. "It is simply the only answer people like you usually accept." The words landed harder than she intended. Something shifted briefly in Adrian's expression. Not anger. Recognition. Before he could respond, the kitchen manager hurried toward them nervously. "Evelyn, table 12 needs service." She nodded once, grateful for the interruption. Then disappeared back into the dining room carrying menus against her chest. Adrian watched her move between crowded tables in thoughtful silence. He had spent years surrounded by geniuses and elites, yet none of them had looked at him the way Evelyn Carter did, as if she could see right through his layers of wealth and find the insecurity underneath. None of them unsettled him the way Evelyn Carter did. 30 minutes later, Adrian still sat near the front windows of the restaurant with untouched black coffee growing cold beside him. Every few minutes, his attention drifted back toward Evelyn almost against his own will. She moved through the dining room quickly and quietly, never wasting motion, never pretending to be charming for tips the way some servers did. Even exhaustion seemed restrained in her. Nothing about her suggested a woman desperate to impress. If anything, she simply looked exhausted by the world entirely. At one point, an elderly woman near the back windows smiled warmly as Evelyn refilled her tea. "You always remember my order," the woman said kindly. "Chamomile with lemon," Evelyn replied softly. "No sugar." The small smile that crossed her face lasted barely a second. But Adrian noticed it immediately. Across from him, Olivia Bennett, Adrian Whitmore's longtime chief of staff, followed his gaze toward the dining room and smirked faintly. "You've been staring at her for 10 straight minutes." Adrian looked away at once. "I'm thinking. About the waitress who corrected you in front of Manhattan's financial elite." "She corrected a doctoral-level equation in under 2 minutes," Adrian said quietly. Olivia's expression shifted immediately. "Seriously? Perfect German. Perfect French. Princeton Fellowship." Adrian leaned back slightly. "Then 3 years ago, she disappeared." Olivia glanced toward Evelyn again. "That does not sound accidental." "No," Adrian murmured. "It doesn't." Near the end of lunch service, Evelyn finally slipped into the narrow employee hallway beside the kitchen and allowed herself one slow breath. Her feet burned. Her head ached. Worst of all, Adrian Whitmore's questions refused to leave her alone. She opened her locker and pulled out the worn notebook from her bag. Pages of equations and unfinished research filled the margins beside grocery lists and medication schedules. 2 completely different lives trapped inside the same notebook. Her phone buzzed suddenly. "Hospital number." Evelyn answered immediately. "Miss Carter," the nurse said apologetically, "your mother's insurance claim was denied again this morning. We still need confirmation for next week's treatment." Evelyn closed her eyes. "How much?" There was a brief pause. $4,800. Nearly 2 months of wages. "I understand," Evelyn whispered. After the call ended, she remained standing there silently for several seconds, one hand gripping the edge of the locker door. There was nothing left to sell anymore. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Evelyn." She straightened instantly. Adrian Whitmore stood in the hallway holding her notebook carefully in one hand. "You left this near table 14, he said calmly. Evelyn stepped forward quickly to take it, but Adrian's eyes had already caught the open pages inside. Differential equations. Research models. Princeton references. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. Adrian glanced down at the notebook once more before slowly lifting his eyes back to hers. "Your unfinished thesis," he said, his voice dropping to a low, focused tone. "It was about predictive collapse systems, wasn't it?" "These are Princeton research models," he said quietly. Silence settled between them again. Then, almost carefully now, Adrian added, you were writing a doctoral thesis on predictive collapse systems. The most dangerous moment in a person's life is realizing they could have been someone else. Evelyn felt the air leave her lungs as Adrian Whitmore stood in the narrow employee hallway, holding her notebook beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of sterling oak. For a moment, neither of them moved. The restaurant noise beyond the hallway sounded strangely distant now. Evelyn stepped forward immediately, and took the notebook from his hands, closing it tightly against her chest. "You should not read other people's things," she said quietly. Adrian didn't apologize. Instead, his eyes drifted briefly toward the worn notebook. "This doesn't belong in a restaurant hallway." The words should have sounded flattering. Instead, they only made Evelyn tired. She looked away first. "People romanticize sacrifice when it is not happening to them," she said, her voice devoid of any pride. Silence settled briefly between them. Up close, Adrian could finally see how exhausted she truly was. Not ordinary exhaustion. The kind carried by people who had been surviving for too long. "What happened?" he asked quietly. Evelyn gave a faint humorless smile. "Life." Adrian waited. For some reason, that made it harder for her not to answer. "My mother got sick," she said after a moment. He remained silent. 3 surgeries in 14 months. Evelyn's fingers tightened slightly around the notebook. "Then my father died." Another pause. "After that, survival became more important than Princeton." The fluorescent lights hummed softly above them. Somewhere beyond the hallway, silverware clinked against plates, while lunch service continued like nothing important was happening at all. Adrian glanced toward the notebook again. "You still work on the research?" "Sometimes." "Why?" For the first time, real emotion flickered visibly across Evelyn's face. "Not anger. Grief. Because it hurts less than pretending that part of me never existed." The answer stayed with Adrian longer than he expected. Before he could respond, the kitchen manager suddenly appeared around the corner. "Evelyn, table 6 needs service." She nodded once immediately, grateful for the interruption. "I need to work." Adrian stepped aside to let her pass. As Evelyn walked back toward the dining room, something near the heel of her shoe caught his attention. The sole had started separating slightly. Clear tape held it together from the inside. The detail hit him harder than the Princeton record somehow. 20 minutes later, Adrian still sat near the restaurant windows while untouched coffee cooled beside him. Rain blurred across the Manhattan streets outside. Olivia slid into the seat across from him and studied his expression carefully. "You look disturbed." Adrian stared toward the dining room where Evelyn quietly refilled glasses near the back tables. "She left Princeton because her mother was dying." Olivia's expression softened. "That explains why she disappeared." Adrian nodded faintly. "I built my entire career believing that in this world, intelligence and merit naturally rise to the top," Adrian said quietly. Olivia followed his gaze toward Evelyn. "Now I'm watching one of the smartest people I've ever met refill iced tea for tourists." For years, he had believed intelligence naturally rose to the top. Talent. Discipline. Merit. Now one of the smartest people he had ever met was carrying trays through a restaurant, while hiding taped shoes beneath her uniform. "I used to think talent always found its way upward," Adrian said quietly. "And now?" Adrian remained silent for several seconds. Then finally, "Now I'm not so sure." Across the dining room, Evelyn balanced another tray against one hand, while forcing herself through the motions she knew too well. Smile politely. Refill drinks. Pretend exhaustion felt normal. Pretend dreams no longer hurt. Her phone buzzed suddenly inside her apron pocket. "Daniel." Evelyn checked the message quickly. Mom collapsed again. They admitted her back into St. Vincent's. The color drained from her face instantly. The tray in her hand trembled slightly. Across the restaurant, Adrian noticed immediately. He watched Evelyn grip the edge of the counter for balance, before pulling off her apron with shaking hands. Then she grabbed her bag and hurried toward the front exit. Evelyn. She stopped near the glass doors but didn't turn around. Rain hammered softly outside, while the restaurant behind them faded into distant background noise. Adrian stepped closer carefully. "What are the doctors saying?" Evelyn said nothing. His voice softened further. "Is there anything they still can do? Pride becomes very expensive when the people you love are running out of time." Evelyn stopped near the restaurant entrance, while rain hammered softly against the glass doors beside her. Adrian Whitmore stood only a few feet away beneath the warm restaurant lights, his expression unreadable now. Around them, conversations had faded into uneasy silence. Customers pretended not to stare. The staff pretended not to listen. "How much does the treatment cost?" Adrian asked quietly. Evelyn looked down for a moment before answering. "Too much." He waited. Finally, she tightened her grip on her bag. $4,800 by next week. Even saying the number aloud felt exhausting now. Adrian said nothing immediately. For a man who spent more than that on wine at charity dinners, the amount sounded painfully small. And somehow, that made it worse. "Evelyn," he said carefully. "Let me help." She looked at him instantly. No, the sharpness in her voice surprised even him. "That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" Rain crashed harder against the windows beside them. "My mother needs treatment," Adrian said softly. "And I need dignity." Silence. The words settled heavily between them. Evelyn shook her head once, trying to steady herself again. "Men like you always think money fixes the damage after you finally notice someone's humanity," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of pride and pain. Adrian said nothing. For the first time in years, he had no intelligent response prepared. Evelyn pushed open the restaurant door, and stepped out into the cold Manhattan rain before he could stop her. By the time Adrian followed her outside, she was already disappearing into the blur of umbrellas, headlights, and crowded sidewalks. Adrian remained motionless beneath the gray afternoon sky, while rain slowly darkened the shoulders of his coat. Olivia stepped beside him quietly. "You can't solve this one with a check." Adrian kept staring toward the subway entrance where Evelyn had vanished. "I know." For the first time in years, he hated feeling powerless more than he hated losing. He almost called after her again. But something told him Evelyn Carter would hate being chased right now. That evening, Evelyn sat beside her mother's hospital bed at St. Vincent's, while heart monitors beeped softly through the dim room. Her mother looked smaller lately. Fragile beneath pale blankets and fluorescent lights. "You look tired, sweetheart," she whispered weakly. "Long shift." Her mother studied her face carefully. Something else happened. Evelyn adjusted the blanket near her mother's shoulders. "I met someone who reminded me why I stopped believing rich people understood anything real." A faint smile touched her mother's face. "Complicated usually means important." Evelyn looked down quietly. That was answer enough. Near midnight, Evelyn finally drifted asleep in the chair beside the hospital bed, one arm still resting near her mother's hand. A nurse entered the room quietly a short while later carrying a folder. She frowned slightly while checking the paperwork twice. Then her eyes settled on the top page. Temporary financial authorization approved. Payment status pending review. The nurse glanced once toward the sleeping Evelyn, confused. Because the approval signature line was completely blank. The hardest apologies are the ones spoken through actions instead of words. Morning sunlight spilled weakly through the hospital blinds, as Evelyn slowly opened her eyes in the stiff chair, beside her mother's bed. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then the soft beeping monitors, the smell of antiseptic, and the ache in her neck brought reality back instantly. Her mother was still asleep beneath the pale blankets, breathing steadier now than the night before. Evelyn rubbed her tired eyes and noticed the folder resting on the bedside table. She reached for it absently, expecting more paperwork, more bills, more impossible numbers. But the second she opened the file, her entire body froze. For the first time in months, the billing department had stopped calling her phone. Evelyn stared at the page in disbelief. She flipped through the documents once, then again more carefully. Several overdue balances had been cleared. Her mother's next treatment cycle had already been approved. Her hands trembled slightly now. "Miss Carter," a nurse said gently from the doorway. Evelyn looked up immediately. "There has to be some mistake." The nurse smiled softly. "No mistake. Someone covered the remaining balance late last night." Evelyn already knew who. The realization settled heavily in her chest, tangled somewhere between relief and anger. Across the city, Adrian Whitmore stood alone inside his penthouse office, while untouched financial reports covered his desk. For the first time that morning, he loosened his tie. He had not slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Evelyn standing in the rain, outside Sterling Oak, saying the one sentence he could not stop replaying in his mind. "And I need dignity." Olivia entered quietly. The hospital confirmed everything went through anonymously. Adrian nodded once without looking away from the skyline. "Good." Olivia studied him carefully. "You know she is going to hate this." Adrian finally glanced toward her. "Her mother gets treatment. That is not the point." He knew that too. That was the problem. Meanwhile, Evelyn arrived at Sterling Oak nearly an hour early for her shift, exhaustion shadowing her face beneath the restaurant lights. The second she entered the employee hallway, she noticed the whispers start again. But this time it was different. People were not mocking her anymore. They were curious. Careful. Almost respectful. "You okay?" one waitress asked quietly. Evelyn forced a small nod. "Fine." But she was not fine. Because for the first time in years, someone had stepped into her collapsing world, and changed something she could not fix herself. And somehow that unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Near noon, the front restaurant doors opened again. Evelyn looked up instinctively from the service station, and saw Adrian walking inside wearing a dark gray coat. Their eyes met instantly across the dining room. Neither of them looked away this time. Adrian approached slowly, while conversations nearby faded lower and lower. When he finally stopped in front of her, Evelyn spoke first. "You had no right." Adrian's expression remained calm. "Your mother needed help. That was not your decision to make. Would you rather watch her suffer, because your pride refuses assistance?" The words landed harder than he intended. Evelyn's jaw tightened immediately. "You think money gives you permission to control everything?" Adrian took a slow breath. "No. I respected your independence, I just couldn't watch you drown." Silence stretched between them, while the entire restaurant pretended not to. "Listen again." Then Evelyn looked at him with tired eyes, that suddenly seemed far older than 30 years old. "You really do not understand, do you?" She whispered softly. Adrian frowned slightly. "Understand what?" Evelyn swallowed once before answering the one truth she had hidden from almost everyone for years. "My mother wasn't the only reason I disappeared. Some people do not abandon their dreams. They bury them after the world teaches them those dreams are dangerous." The restaurant felt strangely quiet after Evelyn's words settled between them. Even the soft jazz playing through Sterling Oak seemed distant now beneath the weight in her voice. Adrian stood motionless across from her, while waiters carried plates carefully around the dining room, pretending not to notice the tension near the service station. "The reason I left Princeton was not just my mother." Evelyn lowered her eyes briefly before continuing. "There was a professor overseeing my research during my second year. Dr. Howard Mercer." Adrian recognized the name instantly. Mercer was famous in academic finance and predictive systems theory. Brilliant. Influential. Untouchable. Evelyn folded her arms tightly across herself as if the memory alone made the room colder. At first he treated me like a prodigy. He pushed me harder than everyone else. At first he made me feel chosen, then I realized he only valued my work when nobody knew it belonged to me. Her voice remained steady, but Adrian noticed how tightly her fingers gripped the edge of her sleeve now. Then one day, I discovered portions of my predictive collapse work inside one of his private presentations. Adrian's expression darkened slightly. He stole your research. Evelyn gave a faint humorless smile. Not officially. He changed enough variables to call it collaborative work. And Princeton allowed that? Princeton protected the professor bringing in multimillion-dollar grants. The bitterness in her voice was quiet but deep. I tried reporting it. Nobody wanted a 27-year-old doctoral candidate accusing one of the most respected names in the department. Especially not one already struggling financially. Adrian stared at her silently, while pieces finally started fitting together. The exhaustion. The guarded distance. The way she reacted anytime power and money tried solving problems for her. Then my mother got sick 3 months later. She swallowed once. After that, survival mattered more than being right. Adrian felt something unfamiliar settle heavily in his chest again. For the first time, the systems he had spent his life admiring suddenly looked very different. Did he publish the work? Adrian asked quietly. Evelyn nodded once. Last year. And nobody knows it was yours? Her eyes met his finally. People only believe brilliance belongs to certain kinds of people. The sentence hit Adrian harder than anything she had said before, because he realized he had done exactly that the night they met. Across the restaurant, Olivia entered carrying a tablet before immediately sensing the tension between them. She approached carefully. Adrian, the board meeting starts in 20 minutes. Adrian barely looked away from Evelyn. Cancel it. Olivia blinked. You never cancel board meetings. Today I am. Olivia studied his face for a moment before quietly stepping back. Evelyn shook her head faintly in disbelief. You cannot fix this. Adrian looked at her carefully. Maybe not. Then after a pause, he added, but I can stop pretending people like Mercer deserve protection. Evelyn's expression shifted slightly for the first time. Not trust. But surprise. Before she could answer, the restaurant television mounted above the bar suddenly changed from financial news to a live university press conference. A reporter's voice echoed softly through the dining room. Princeton University announced, this morning that Professor Howard Mercer will receive the National Innovation Award, for his groundbreaking predictive systems research. Evelyn went completely still. On the screen behind the reporter appeared a familiar equation. Her equation. The same theorem, she had written years ago inside the notebook, Adrian accidentally read beside table 14. The truth becomes powerful the moment someone finally refuses to stay silent. The restaurant television continued playing. Quietly, above the bar, while customers turned their attention toward the breaking university press conference. Professor Howard Mercer smiled confidently beneath flashing cameras as Princeton officials praised his revolutionary predictive systems research. But Evelyn Carter could barely hear the reporter anymore. Her entire body had gone still. Across the screen, behind Mercer glowed equations, she recognized instantly, because she had written them alone at 3 o'clock in the morning. Beside hospital beds and overdue bills years before anyone else cared they existed. Adrian Whitmore watched the color drain from her face. That is your work, he said quietly. Evelyn nodded once without taking her eyes off the television. Every line. Around them, Sterling Oak suddenly felt too small to hold the weight of the moment. Adrian looked back at the screen where Mercer accepted applause meant for someone else. Then slowly, something inside him hardened. Do you still have your original research files? Evelyn finally looked at him again, uncertain where this conversation was heading now. Most of them. Emails? Drafts? Timestamps? Yes. Adrian reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a business card before sliding it carefully across the counter toward her. Meet me tonight after your shift. Evelyn frowned immediately. Why? Adrian's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath it now. Because powerful men should stop getting rich from stealing brilliant women's work. The sentence stunned her into silence. For the first time since they met, Adrian did not sound like the billionaire who humiliated her in a ballroom. He sounded angry on her behalf. That frightened her almost as much as it comforted her. Late that evening, rain still covered Manhattan when Evelyn stepped cautiously into Whitmore Capital for the first time. The lobby alone looked larger than her entire apartment building, polished black marble reflecting soft golden lights while security guards greeted Adrian by name the second the elevator doors opened. Evelyn followed him upstairs quietly, clutching her worn notebook against her chest like armor. Inside the top executive conference room, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline glowing silver beneath the storm clouds. Olivia sat at the far end of the table beside two legal advisors and a technology ethics consultant. Every person in the room stood the moment Evelyn entered. The reaction alone made her uncomfortable. Adrian pulled out a chair gently beside him. Sit. Evelyn hesitated before sitting carefully at the massive glass table. One of the attorneys opened a folder filled with printed documents. Miss Carter, Whitmore Capital's legal and research team spent the last 48 hours reviewing archived submissions, metadata timestamps, and conference drafts, published by Howard Mercer this morning against the material Adrian recovered from Princeton archives. The woman slid several papers across the table. Side-by-side comparisons. Dates. Research notes. Identical equations. Evelyn stared silently at the pages while her chest tightened painfully. Years of being ignored suddenly existed in undeniable black ink. You can prove this, she whispered. The attorney nodded firmly. Not only can we prove it. We can prove authorship. Evelyn lowered her eyes immediately. I do not want revenge. Adrian watched her carefully from across the table. What do you want? Evelyn remained quiet for several seconds before answering honestly. I want one moment in my life where somebody sees me before judging me. Silence filled the room. Adrian felt the words settle heavily inside him because he knew exactly how badly he had failed that test the night they met. Slowly, he reached into his coat pocket, and placed something small onto the glass table in front of her. The folded linen napkin from the gala. Her handwritten corrections still visible beneath the faint ink stains. Evelyn looked at it in surprise. Adrian's voice softened for the first time. I saw a waitress that night. He paused briefly before continuing. Now I think I finally see the woman.